USCAN, US Climate Action Network, is the US part of this big international network. So we are 195 organizations right now. Many faith organizations, many multi-issue social justice organizations, and of course the kind of mainstream environmental groups as well. And we are just like one of many coalitions out there of groups that are advancing climate justice that have more and more alignment in terms of the second point that you wanted to talk about, right? That we actually must center racial justice and economic justice in our work, because these issues are really fully integrated and intertwined. And so USCAN, historically, we started in 1989 with a lot of our members very focused on the UN climate talks. It's of course been in the news a lot that the US has now begun that process of re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement. That's a big part of our role at CAN, is making sure our members have access to those UN talks. That's a big place where our members get together. Our members and volunteers of member organizations are also welcome to participate in all of our action teams and in the grassroots movement building work that we do, that Liz is also very familiar with through something called Arm in Arm. And so there's just so many opportunities to engage in the community through any lens. And I will say that I particularly love folks who come to the community from the faith lens. And the reason is that it's a group of people who don't shy away when we talk about that at some point this is going to require some sacrifice of us. And I think that that is the reality that we are facing right now. We have an uphill battle, even though we have this trifecta. And so we have so many tables. We have Climate Justice Alliance, we have USCAN, we participate in something called the Green New Deal Network. We sit at a table called 5 Tables. There's so many groupings, and we're getting more and more aligned. And there's so many places we can come together. And also I also feel like, as much volunteer energy as people have, we are able and need to absorb. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, B. And I would also very much welcome Jackie and Avery and Liz, of course, to correct anything and build.
Y'all want to chime in?
Sure, I can go next. And United Methodist Women, for those who are not aware, is a member of US Climate Action Network. And I really appreciate this question, B, that you set for us, because some of us may think, oh, United Methodist Women, we should just stay in our lane and be focused here, right? And some of you who attended UMW at National Assembly or Leadership Development Days, may have participated in a workshop called Wearing Your UMW Hat. And it's, being proud to wear your UMW hat. And the assumption and expectation is that we are just not hanging out amongst ourselves, right? Because the work that we need to do requires partnership and collaboration. And I think that's the 150-year history of United Methodist Women. So I just wanted to share kind of within UMW organizationally how we connect as well, right? We have our members that we connect with at our unit, circle, unit, district, conference level. Within the United Methodist connection, we have the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement, where United Methodist Women was one of the founding members of the broader Methodist movement. And that brings in networks, higher ed, et cetera, young people throughout the connection, Earth Keepers, et cetera. You have the interagency work between church and society, global ministries, higher ed, Westpath, and United Methodist Women. There's the ecumenical connection with Creation Justice Ministries. Shanta and Avery's here, and we've partnered with them. The World Council of Churches, various National Council of Churches and State Council of Churches, and that's why Texas Impact is such a huge role as well, which also then relates with the interfaith and religious networks like Texas Impact, Interfaith Power and Light, WISC, which is the Washington Interfaith Staff Community, Green Faith. And then, so we recognize we come from the faith lens, we see those connections. And then as Keya was talking about the broader alignment, we really try to ensure that we're not just talking amongst faith groups. And we really want to connect with environmental justice, fence line, and frontline groups that are directly being impacted. Their experiences are the most important in terms of how do we hear, as Jesus did, let the children come to me, Jesus hung out, Jesus was from the margins, not from the center. And so we in United Methodist Women have been trying to do that as well. And so USCAN has been a very important space where we partner and collaborate and share our experiences, and we come together for common action, so we don't do it alone.
Jackie, I want to jump to you. Liz, thank you. That is so helpful. And you said something that made me want to immediately turn to Jackie and say, 20 years ago, people talked about climate change as a boutique issue. Is that this is an issue that communities of color, vulnerable people don't see themselves as having a role in. They don't think their voices are being heard. You've worked to change that, and I think the evidence suggests been very successful. So can you talk a little bit about how you and your colleagues have changed the face of the American grassroots climate community?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, definitely. When I was first getting started in the climate work in the United States, kind of as my full-time focus, it was there was a lot that was happening, that frontline communities were already engaged on climate without actually naming climate. And so that was one of the gaps that I felt like I needed to work on bridging in terms of helping folks to understand. And the first thing I actually did back in 2008, when I first started doing this more deeply, was to go on the road and interview different folks who were did like a video elevating women who were working in the post-Katrina context on disaster equity. So they weren't necessarily talking about climate, but they were really dealing with the aftermath of a climate disaster, working with folks who were working on the front lines of the oil and gas or the coal, just really telling their stories of fighting against these toxic facilities, which they weren't naming climate, but they were doing climate mitigation work. People who were doing work on food justice, who again just saw that there was hunger in their communities, and they saw that they needed to build local food movements, which is critical to moving us away from climate change causing challenges. And so really just lifting up those stories. And then also as the NAACP, starting to really both help to weave that narrative around how these communities are on the front lines of the types of changes that we need. And then also helping the communities to see that without explicit naming, they're actually part of a broader movement to advance climate justice. And so, yeah, thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you. And Avery, Jackie just said the magic word, right? It was a climate disaster. So part of that grassroots narrative has to do with an unfolding understanding of how climate resilience plays into all this. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to say, it's great to be with you all. I'm sorry that you had to downgrade from Shantha to me, but it's a blessing to be here, and I'm taking notes just to be a student as well as a panelist. But yeah, I think what the last few years have made clear, and that we knew before, but I have made clear, is that the climate crisis is here, and that communities we love and care about are being deeply, deeply devastated by the results of climate change, whether it's wildfires or heat waves or hurricanes. And so, it's time to do away with a dichotomy between climate mitigation or preventing climate change and climate resilience and adapting to climate change. What we really need is a posture towards resilience that combines climate mitigation, that combines climate adaptation, and that combines deep democracy and a commitment to equity. And so that's really what we've been working on with Creation Justice Ministries. This central question around climate resilience that we have is, how can churches become hubs of climate resilience? How can they help their communities weather both the physical and the spiritual storms of the climate crisis that are showing their face more and more every year?
Keya, I just want to turn back to you for a second, having heard all this, and say, can you talk a little bit about the how the role of the faith community has changed in the time that you've been working on climate change, as we've started to bridge that that gap between mitigation and adaptation?
Sure. Well, one place where the faith community has always been an incredibly strong pillar has been around what we call climate finance, kind of in jargon. And this notion that as the biggest contributor to climate change, that we as a country, the United States, has to do more to fix the climate crisis than just deal with emissions and our domestic emissions. And in fact, both here and abroad, we have to support people who are dealing with the impacts of climate change. And we also have to support additional reductions in poorer countries as a completely integral part of what we're doing. And so for me, a lot of my first interactions with the faith community on climate were about, churches acting as disaster response locations and playing a really important role in that response. And that bridged to this role I was just talking about, of being really strong in climate finance and making, that case. And now what I see much more broadly is a moral call to action on all elements of this. We need a Green New Deal. We need to change our society. We need to do away with neoliberalism and the flaws of capitalism that have resulted in massive inequality, structural racism. All of that has to be dismantled so we can actually achieve liberation for all of us and for Black and Brown and Indigenous people. And that kind of moral call to action is really powerful and a really incredibly important contribution.
So talking about how it's that moral call has become so central to the whole climate movement. And I guess I'll throw it open to see who wants to talk first. But I mean, let's talk for a minute about how, maybe even a couple of minutes, about how racial justice and climate justice, two issues that didn't seem to be necessarily holding hands, turn out, in fact, to be two sides of the same coin. How could that be true? I'll let anybody start who wants to.
I just spoke, so I mean, how about I'll start very briefly and then I'll pass it to feel like I just spoke, but no one was volunteering. I mean, I feel like we wouldn't even have a climate crisis if we didn't have racism in this country, because I don't understand where all of these coal-fired power plants, pipelines, that explode, et cetera, would have been put. And I feel that they would not have been put in rich white communities. And there would have been a fight. And maybe when Jimmy Carter wanted to make this transition off of fossil fuels, we would have made it. So I'll make that brief statement and then pass it on to others about how deeply integrated these issues are.
Liz, were you going to say something?
Sure, I can go next. I think about the United Methodist resolutions and statements that we have around environmental racism, and recognizing that when we environmental racism, right? The history of racism and environmental justice are directly connected to climate justice as well. And so the United Church of Christ had produced a report, right, in the 80s, and that had showed their Commission for Racial Justice that said that toxic waste and race in the United States, rather than poverty, land value, or home ownership, is the most reliable predictor of proximity to hazardous waste sites in the United States. Right. So what Keya was speaking about, where would we have these power plants? Where would we have these toxic fossil fuel emitting and air polluting, environmentally health degrading plants if there wasn't communities seen as sacrifice zones? And in the United States, that's heavily racialized, unfortunately. And so that connection again and again has played out in the United States. And so we could talk about the climate crisis broadly, but also the cause of climate crisis being fossil fuel emissions and those power plants, extraction sites being in communities of color, that we need to address both and, right? So if we're going to address the climate crisis, it can't be just about emissions reduction. It needs to be about just transition for those communities that their bodies have already borne the brunt of the toxic fumes and emissions.
Yeah, and maybe Jackie, if you want to elaborate, and then also if you can unpack that term that Liz just used, just transition. That's probably something many people haven't heard before.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I would kind of in some ways take it all the way back to the foundation of this country and of the United States anyway. And so, and how this kind of greed, exploitation, extraction is at the foundation of the way these lands were colonized, and so whether it's certainly the murder and so forth of indigenous folks who are the original nations on this land, and then the reckless extraction of natural resources, and then the extraction of Black people from Africa to be brought over as commodities in the hulls of ships to become what the enslaved labor that built this nation. And so it really kind of like those same practices and principles, so to speak, of extraction, exploitation, and so forth, are at the root of racism and are at the root of the very types of practices that have gotten us to where we are on the path to catastrophic climate change. And so that really ties directly into this notion of just transition, because just transition is about moving us away from being this society that's built on extraction, exploitation, domination, all of those types of practices that are harming Earth and Earth's inhabitants, to transitioning to a society that's built on principles and practices of deep caring, of cooperation, and of deep democracy. And so that and the way that just transition happens, of course, led by frontline communities, led by workers who are impacted by the shifting of our economy, and really centering Earth and harmony with the Earth, and centering human rights and well-being. So that's kind of putting it in a big nutshell, but there's a lot of sub bullets under that. But that's what I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, on that note, Jackie, just around extraction, I want to add sort of a theological lens to this too, just knowing that we're talking to, a group of United Methodists. And, that's that as people of faith, especially as Christians, I think we have to come to terms with the way that our theology was weaponized to be a tool of extraction. An author who's done really good work on this is named Willie James Jennings. And what he shows in his book, The Christian Imagination, is the inextricable link between a theology of extraction and the development of race, and therefore the development of racism. And that the same sort of extractive mindset that is going on through the exploitation of natural resources has been going on through, the extraction of labor through slavery, the extraction of unpaid labor even today. And so, I saw someone in the comments saying that, racism doesn't cause pollution. That's right, racism doesn't cause pollution, but it's that same extractive mindset that keeps them linked. And so racism is inextricably linked to pollution. And so therefore, when we're talking about climate justice, we have to talk about racial justice, because even back to the beginning, even the theological foundations, the two are tied together.
So one of the things that I want to make sure I don't derail my own organizational structure, but it makes me want to talk to y'all about this particular thing. So one of the things that we bump up against all the time in climate policy that is different from other policy areas that the faith community works in often. So different from all the domestic social policy issues, different from domestic criminal justice. climate change is a global issue. And when we talk about the issues that you're describing, exploitation, extraction, racism, greed, in the area of climate change, we're not just talking about one part of the American population versus another part of that same country's population. We're also talking about us on a global stage. So one of the things, Keya, that you might clarify is what the Climate Action Network, the international, is, how that works. And then maybe if we could talk a little bit about what it looks like for the United States, and particularly the American faith communities, to be having this realization that we are culpable in the development of those extractive ideas in our own country, and at the same time to have people in the global South saying, boy, nobody in your country has it as bad as your country has made it for our whole continent. I just want to kind of get us up to a global level there. So I'll say maybe, Keya, if you can start framing that.
I live just a few blocks from the Capitol, and so I will say that we have messed things up enough that I now get lots of emails and calls and texts of concern from people from every continent, worried that that I live in the most unsafe place in the world, both in terms of COVID and people refusing to face the reality of that and wearing masks, in terms of the blatant racism where you have like gallows and Confederate flags being brought to the United States Capitol. And like we live on a very small street where we had people like wearing Nazi paraphernalia with weapons on our street all night. And I do think that we have this notion of US exceptionalism that is not exactly right, and that we now are being forced to face. And I want to go back to something Jackie was talking about, which is kind of, I think hard for people to grasp why we need to go back in history to colonialism sometimes. But that is the starting point of the conversation at the UN. And that is the starting point of the conversation around the world, which is that people of European descent traveled around the world, and some places like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand became settler colonialists and formed nation states after stealing land. In other places, went into countries, took every bit of wealth that they could, destroyed every bit of society that they could, and countries are reeling from that today. And when they look at years of neoliberalism and US capitalism and US large corporations that have raped their countries, and then the United States comes and starts pointing fingers at them and saying, this is a global problem, everyone needs to act, it doesn't feel fair, because the starting point of the story is different than maybe the starting point of the story of a US diplomat. And so this is a hard conversation for us to absorb as a country, because it forces us to look in the mirror and realize that maybe we aren't who we thought we are. Maybe we're actually something different. And I can never even come close to achieving the beauty of that poem that we heard on inauguration. But for me, some of the power of it was that it enabled us to see ourselves as an unfinished project, not as something that is like broken beyond repair, but it's something that we have not done yet. We have not yet figured out how to be just, how to be fair, how to be good neighbors to people in the rest of the world. But I believe that we have a community that is dedicated to figuring that out. And I believe who we're talking with tonight is part of that community.
Absolutely. So I want to see if any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that idea of kind of our global place. And Liz, maybe, because the United Methodist Church is a global church.
Yeah, and I appreciate this because just earlier this week, we had a conversation where we brought in USCAN drafters of the US Fair Share. And we had the drafters speak, and they had basically, the US Fair Share is acknowledging that, as Keya had noted, right, we are only 4% of the world's population, emitting over 25% of cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions or more. What is our fair share and responsibility? and how do we respond to that? And one of the things that I want to remind all of us who are United Methodists is that, and United Methodist Women, our Book of Resolution actually acknowledges that we have a disproportionate impact, disproportionate responsibility. And also we, even within the global United Methodist Church, when we think about the floods that are happening in Mozambique, and sea level rising, impact in Mozambique, I'm thinking about within our United Methodist connection, right? The United Methodist Church is in Mozambique, in the Philippines. It's because of our own consumptions and activities, and our reliance on fossil fuels when there are alternative sources. So it is then, I would say, as people of faith, I think we're good at both acknowledging, because we are those who recognize that we have sinned against God, and thinking about the original call within Genesis, that God called us to be stewards of God's creation, and we have failed in that. And there are resolutions that speak about the acts of repentance, both towards Indigenous communities, but repentance is part of our Christian faith living, right? So when we see that we have wronged God's creation, when we have wronged others in society, we have an opportunity, right? And repentance is about building bridges, returning back and making amends. And the great thing is that God doesn't just throw us away as outcasts, but God is inviting us, saying, be co-creators, be healers, repent. I think about Isaiah 58, when the Israelites are praying, God, why do you not respond when we are fasting even and praying to you? And the response is, if you break the bonds of injustice. And I think about the global bonds of US capitalism sometimes, our influence globally, when we privilege, even thinking about the COVID vaccine distribution, there is not equity in this process, right? And so I think we need to, the role that we as faith communities and United Methodist Women can do is saying we acknowledge our wrong and we want to make change, and we want our policy makers and decision makers to make change, even if that means, as someone said earlier, means our sacrifice. I want to also just acknowledge the gender component, as our vision at United Methodist Women is faith, hope, love, and action on behalf of women, children, and youth around the world. And that's been part of our history. The United Nations reports that 80% of those being displaced by climate change are women. And globally, women are often the primary caregivers, providers of food, fuel. It makes them more vulnerable to drought and flooding when they occur. And I think about the tsunami in 2004, that surviving men outnumbered women by almost 3-1 in Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and in India, because men were more likely to be able to swim. Women lost precious evacuation time looking for children and relatives. So there's a gender component as well that we need to think about, of how this is impacting women and children around the world. And as United Methodist Women, we have an obligation, and I think a call to really respond.
Avery, Jackie, you want to jump in at all before I keep us moving through my outline?
That was great. I have nothing to add past that, Lee. Thanks for those.
Jackie, I guess I would have a specific question for you about the Black community in the United States interacting in the COP, and how, what the that interaction with the global community, including the Global South, may have done to strengthen the resolve of the Black community in the United States to take a leadership role on these issues.
Thank you. Yes. So when I first started going to the COP in 2009, I was very struck by how few Black folks from the United States were there, and how the few, even of the few, that several were there because they were with international organizations talking about foreign policy, but not actually talking about the domestic agenda here, and in the context of the UN. And so that was that was striking. Secondly, the work that when we first went in 2009, we immediately connected with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And that really became the beginning of a relationship that has lasted through the 11 years, now 12. And what was interesting there was that before we started to have those conversations, they were saying that they didn't know about the plight of African Americans, and didn't really kind of grasp this concept that we often talk about in terms of the South within the North, in terms of having similar characteristics in terms of disproportionate impact and less responsibility of climate change. And so that became a beginning of us, them, when the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance came to the United States over time. Then we hosted them in our communities and really helped to begin to facilitate them hearing those stories. And then we started to have more exchanges where then I or others would go and speak at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance meetings, and we would do joint Hill visits together when we would be here, and they would also really begin to grow relationships with our communities directly and see this kind of racial justice agenda as truly being a Pan-African, including the diaspora, not just across Pan-African in terms of on the motherland itself. And so then together we decided to launch this initiative of the Global Afro-Descendant Initiative on environmental and climate justice, to connect not only the US Afro-Descendant folks, but people who are Afro-Descendant even in Europe and so forth, to really talk about how do we have a common advocacy agenda. And so with communities that the frontline communities of the NAACP and others, really seeing themselves connected to this global agenda and to this global network of Black folks, really deepen the meaning and the understanding of, even when we're fighting against a coal-fired power plant here or a natural gas plant, then our advocacy can't stop at it not being burned in our communities, but it has to go to, liquefied natural gas exports or coal exports, because now we have this relationship and understand that, what we do also extends beyond our borders. So I'll just pause there.
That's very powerful to me, actually, that story. And I don't know that I've heard you describe it quite that way before. Since we've had a question in the chat about what's the COP, I had an idea at one time that maybe we should do something like where we did a buzzer every time one of the policy people says an acronym, but it was me. I was the one who said it. So I'm glad we didn't have the buzzer today. We could start later. But since we're talking about COP, two things. One, I'm going to ask for Avery, and I have a reason why I want Avery to sort of explain what the COP is. And then everyone else, and we're getting a request to slow down. And I know that we are all used to talking quickly because we all feel like we have so much to say, but I will try to discipline myself to slow down, and hopefully everyone else can do that as well. I meant to say this at the beginning of the session. Texas Impact, with the support of the U.S. Climate Action Network, the financial support of the U.S. Climate Action Network, and in partnership with the United Methodist Church and others, made a curriculum, a study, a video study called The Path of Hope. And I'm about to screen share just enough so that you can find it. But it is, it's a primer on the thing that we're referring to as the COP, the Conference of the Parties, which is this United Nations annual process for making climate policy, that's done in a particular way that lifts up racial and economic justice issues. So let me actually, I'm just going to screen share that really quickly. So, well, that's not that helpful, but this page here is Texas Impact Action Center. And you can get there on our website, texasimpact.org. So it's the Action Center. When you get there, you'll see that we have these different kinds of resources. And one of them is the Path of Hope. And the Path of Hope might resolve here in a second, if I'm lucky. Here we go. This is the Path of Hope. It is a 4-part video series, and I'm not going to try to get you into it, but this is a 4-part video series about the Conference of the Parties, the UN climate negotiations. But the way that we were able to make that video series is that Texas Impact has for several years participated in those United Nations climate negotiations. Jackie's participated, Keya's participated, Liz has participated. And a couple of years ago, I was fortunate that we got to take Avery with Texas Impact to help us engage while we were in Poland. And so Avery, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why it's so important from our kind of congregational and denominational standpoint for people to follow that COP process as it's going on.
Yeah, I'd be happy to say a few words on that. And to be honest, I'd be really interested in everyone else's take on that question too, because I think it gets to the heart of one of the challenges here, which is, the United Nations feels so distant, it feels so global that it's hard to understand the impact that it has on our communities. And so I think it really gets back to what Liz was saying earlier, that, our churches, the rituals that we do in our churches reinforce our faithful belief that we are to be actors of justice, that we are to be actors of equality and equity. And the Conference on Parties is a mechanism for bringing out, when it's at its best, it's a mechanism for bringing forward equality and equity and justice in the world. And so, I think there's an element there of, United States churches being engaged with the United States administration, who is, the diplomats and delegates to the parties, to share with them that that's part of our values. They're representing us. And honestly, there's been a lack of grassroots engagement when it comes to the United Nations conference because it seems so global. So I think at a congregational level, it's really important to make our values known, just like it is when it comes to domestic policy. So I'll leave it there. I'd be really interested to hear what Liz has to say about this too, as someone who's also engaged in the COP before.
I actually haven't engaged in COP physically present because before recently joined UMW, well, not recent, 4.5 years ago, and years before that, I was doing World Council of Churches UN advocacy, and it's when we had our COP colleagues, and then we did the interface at the UN office. So I was bringing a lot more in terms of how does the climate-related components deal with in other spaces, like Commission on the Status of Women, United Nations on Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. So because a lot of the climate and gender components isn't always expressed in other components. I've had other colleagues that attended COP, and I think one of the important things at COP is where we've had our members who attended, and it's where we lift up grassroots voices of women and those directly being impacted, and lifting up the moral kind of clarity, right? Because sometimes it can feel very technical about this, that, we'll add this language, etc. But when we start bringing those who are directly being impacted, our sisters from the Philippines saying that because of sea level rising, because of extraction, this is happening, and we need the urgency and that financing also needs to be allocated, that women's stories and narratives need to be addressed, and that women who are farmers need to be given funds in a patriarchal society. And so prioritizing those voices, I think as faith communities, when we have the delegation, we need to ensure that essentially. So it's not only voices from the United States and only technocrats and policy wonks speaking about the issues. So that's just some background I would provide.
Thanks. And I will add also that one of the ways that we've partnered with UMW around COP and the ways that we've partnered with other of our denominational partners has been that when we're there, so for example, when Avery and other Texas Impact folks were in Poland a couple of years ago, or when we were in Spain last year, we see ourselves there as witnesses who are sharing out the information we're getting from it. So I think a lot of times we think of the opportunity to participate in a policy process, and this could be even, you know, a work session that you get invited to on your city council, or getting to give public testimony in a legislative hearing, but it's definitely true at a global scale. We get those opportunities to participate, and then we kind of become insiders. We're now on the inside participating in the activity. And what we have to remember always is that it's our job, when we have the opportunity to participate in a policy process, to bring everybody along. So our job is to turn back to our community and tell them what's going on and give them ideas of how they can raise their voices too. Jackie, I'd be interested for you to talk about how the NAACP has done that around the COP in the United States with your membership.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, I'll speak maybe most specifically about the 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed. We had a delegation of youth from California, Texas, and New York. And the way we did it was, from before they came, they were responsible for hosting kind of a human rights tribunals and listening sessions in their communities, and really writing up what they hear from their communities, and also sharing with their communities that they're on their way to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties, and they really want to represent the interests of their communities in those conversations. So they presented to the communities about the UN COP, the UNFCCC COP, and then they heard from the community and let them know that they were going to be going and presenting on their behalf. And then they also let them know that they would be coming and then reporting back. And so they did that in terms of brought there. And then at the COP, we did a series of side events where they shared on behalf of their communities. We also did a series of sessions where from Paris, they also talked to their communities back at home. We did Twitter town halls, we did web and all these different things so that it was kind of before, throughout, and then after. There was always this kind of connection of what's happening at home to what's happening there, and back and forth. And then once they came back, they had to do report back sessions to their communities to say, we went, here's how we presented what you share with us, here's what we heard back, here's what our experiences were with the various people that we talked to. And so they actually did video interviews with people that they met while they were there, so they can share that back, so they didn't have to talk on behalf of people back. They were able to show the videos of people talking for themselves. So it's a very kind of intentional and kind of throughout the continuum feedback session.
That's great, thanks. Well, did somebody want to say something? I'm sorry, Avery, were you starting to talk? Okay. I'm conscious of the time. This is kind of a treat for me, I'll just say, to have the four of you here in my office with me. So I want to keep us moving though. So, Keya, I think I want to turn to you and say the new administration took office a couple days ago. So what's new with climate policy in the United States, and what's the state of play for us here at the beginning of this year?
Yeah, there's two sets of things that I think that we should keep an eye on. One is that there's a large team of climate folks, including some beloved folks like Shanta Alonso Reddy, who are inside the administration and will be doing whatever they can with what we call this trifecta. So the executive, the presidency, plus 50 votes in the Senate, plus Madam Vice President Harris as a tiebreaker, plus the House, means that we really need to focus in the next year on getting as much done as can get done. And in the near term, that's going to be related to stimulus, because we are in a really bad economic situation, and that spending needs to be made in a way that does not make the climate crisis worse, and ideally tackles the climate crisis. And so that's a big part of what's going on. There's great people on the inside advancing that work. I also think that really this moment is an important moment for us not to forget at all what just happened at the Capitol building, and for us to redouble our efforts to make sure that we are organizing in our own communities and talking to people in unprecedented ways. And, we have a training we've put together on deep canvassing, and how, it's like based in like how you literally deprogram people who have been in cults. You show vulnerability, and then you elicit a story, and you try to find some common moral ground. You don't argue. You start with something emotional for you, sharing a vulnerability. If you're a young person, I'm afraid to have children because of the climate crisis. I see how drought is affecting my community, or not even on climate, but sharing some vulnerability personally, and doing that hard work of talking to our people and bringing our people in is critically important right now. And so as much as I see, like, absolutely, we have these UN climate talks, we've got Congress, we've got executive actions, all of that is true. For me, there is nothing more important for an organizer right now than to organize. And that means to go and talk to people about things that are hard to talk about. And if we don't do that, I can guarantee you what happened in the Capitol is going to be the least of our problems, because we have some real work to do.
Amen. So I guess can you, just because people will have seen so much press about this, can you talk a little bit about the immediate executive order sort of cascade and what it means for the president to take all these immediate executive actions related to climate and the environment? How real is that? Are they just showpieces? Are they gonna have real impact?
You want me to go again?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it is both really exciting that we re-entered the Paris climate agreements, and that will take 30 days to formally occur. Really excited that we have said no to the Keystone XL pipeline, and also the absolute bare minimum that needed to happen on day one for the climate movement to not be furious. And so we have strength as a movement, and we should realize that. And so yes, it is absolutely wonderful that those things happen. All the executive orders are being revisited that happened under Trump. All of the, these very terrible things, allowing coal ash, allowing mercury, all of that stuff, like literally they were poisoning us. All of that stuff is being revisited, and it's really, really important. There's a lot more that is coming, and because we've heard from the Biden administration that they're focused on 4 topics as their top 4 topics, and the climate crisis is one of them. So I have very high expectations, and also every intention to hold people accountable if those expectations aren't met. And that's part of why we got anything done, is because we had high expectations and have shown that we are willing to use our nonviolent power to, we're so different from the opposition, where they'll go in and like break windows and fly flags of traitors. We are using our nonviolent power to do good things for people, to pop up farmers markets in place, to do mutual aid, to put bus lanes in places where we don't have transit equity. And so we have to keep growing our movement and doing that amazing work that is nonviolent and leans into an ethos of nonviolent, because that is how I will be confident that all the other executive orders that I'm fully expecting will happen, and that all of the other pieces of legislation I'm fully expecting will actually happen. And if y'all can also arrange a recall of Cruz or any of those other folks who voted to throw out people's votes, that'd be pretty cool too.
So before we start, before I just open it up and start doing Q&A, I'm going to say now is the time when you get to issue your marching orders. What are the ambitious actions that you, the four of you, want to invite these 165 sturdy advocates to do over the next, let's say over the next 6 to 10 months, manageable time frame? And I know some of you have slides that you want to show. I'm going to say, maybe can we do Jackie, Liz, Avery, Keya, and Liz and Avery, I know y'all both have slides, and I think maybe Jackie and Keya, I don't know. Keya, do you have slides? Okay, then that's how we'll do it. So Jackie, let's start with you. What are your marching orders for the United Methodist Women?
Thank you. Wow, it's hard to go first, but it's also encouraging because I know people will follow up. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. I would say, man, it is very hard to go first. Also, as an introvert, I would definitely say that we need to be pushing for example, at the municipal level, we need to be pushing for things like clean air ordinances, transit equity ordinances, and so forth, because as we know, all politics are local, and we need to really build that. And as local as you can have these conversations, that it builds up into state level support, that builds up into federal support and transformation. So to the extent that, especially if we're in states where the state level politics aren't necessarily aligned with what we've been talking about today, at the very least, try to push for, don't get kind of overwhelmed and demoralized, see what conversations you can have at the local level to push as hard as possible for local change. So I would say that. And then, so whether it's, clean air ordinances, transit ordinances, local food policies, and so forth, just really starting to push for the types. And then also at the state level, looking at some of the energy shifts that we need to make. So if you don't have renewable portfolio standards to demand that the utility gets a certain percentage of its energy from clean energy sources, then we should be pushing for those types of things. I would just start there, but yeah, so many more.
Full chunks, is that what you're saying? And I did, my good friend Cindy Johnson reminds me that you are offering suggestions, not marching orders, because Keya just assured us that we are nonviolent. So that's right. That's right. So Liz, go ahead, and you should be able to share your screen.
Sure, thank you so much. And I appreciate just this conversation. I was looking on some of the chat just recently. Someone was, I don't know who was speaking about it, but around disabilities. And I appreciate that intersection. Absolutely. I think about US policies and even the church at times, where persons with disabilities are put in the margins. So persons with disability issues, racial issues, economic justice, gender issues, all of these things are interconnected. And with the climate crisis, it's impacting all of those marginalized communities further, right? And I think that's where I want to connect it with what Keya was saying and what some actions that we can do, right? There are stories. We are all being impacted in some way by the climate crisis. And I think understanding how is it impacting me? How is it impacting my community? How is it impacting women, children, and youth in my community, around the world, in the state of Texas, And there's lots of numbers, unfortunately, in terms of how children and women, communities of color are being impacted disproportionately in Texas. So knowing that, I think, is really important to be able to articulate like why you're concerned. And then from there, as Keya said, talk about it. And I think that's something that as women of faith and people of faith, we can do. Are we talking about it in church? Are we talking about it in our UMW circle? Are we talking about it when we're going to vote? Are we talking about it with our elected officials? So talk about it, talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. So I think that's really important. And I'm going to just share my screen and I will have this up available for you later. But for those of you who are wondering, well, what does that mean, right? And why is United Methodist Women specifically working around just energy for all? And that's part of our climate justice campaign. We're actually having a 3-part webinar that's starting February 22nd. And we would love to have at least 10 United Methodist Women in each conference in Texas. So that would be several dozen of you who would participate. And we'll first talk about why should we care? What is our theological grounding? And what compels us as people of faith to respond? And then the what. What is just energy? What is climate justice? What is just transition? Why is biomass problematic? Nuclear, even natural gas, right? It sounds natural. So we'll talk about that. And then part 3 is how do we mobilize and how do we act? And we'll actually be talking about some of the concrete ways that you could move forward this coming year. The next thing is we have our monthly calls every 3rd Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Eastern, which is 2 p.m. Central Time. Please join us. We have different topics. So the US Fair Share presentation that just happened this week. This next month will be focused on advancing just energy for all in transportation. So Jackie was speaking about transit equity. Well, how does that even connect, right? So you'll be able to hear speakers. That'll be our first part 1. And if you want to share your story, we're talking about what is your story, where there's a Transit Equity Days, Rosa Parks' birthday. Did you know that Rosa Parks was an AME member? Faithful woman of faith. And she said her faith called her to resist. And so share your story about transit equity. And coming soon, Keya said, the next few years, we have an opportunity. So one of the things that we're doing at the national office is inviting our members, and we want to partner with Texas Impact, and we're partnering with NRPE to do virtual legislative visits on the Hill. We want you to be able to talk with senators and say why it is important to you. Now, some of you may feel like someone, I think, said on the chat box, it's a red state, it's not going to happen. We are called in scripture for faithful witness. It's not to win. We speak truth no matter what. And so we are like the persistent widow, where we need to talk about God's call, and we need to provide that moral clarity, why Senate, House, Congress must move forward, because executive actions alone will not succeed. So stay up to date and involved with other partner organizations, NAACP, you have the Climate Action Network here, Interfaith Power and Light, and others, which Texas Impact is a part of. And there's so many resources that are available. I want to just acknowledge NAACP's Just Energy Policy and Practice Action Toolkit. It's a great resource, step-by-step material. So there's other slides I have that I'll just share with Bea later on. But there's so many ways you can get involved. And what I would say is just don't leave it as education, right? Our vision as United Methodist Women is faith, hope, love in education. No, it's action. So minimally, after this conversation, at least email or talk to at least 5 people. Thank you.
Avery, how about you?
Amazing. Thanks for that, Liz. And I was going to start my talk by saying that I know United Methodist Women are people of action, because I've worked with the United Methodist Women before, and you all are amazing people of action. So I'm going to talk about some opportunities for climate resilience, both in a policy realm and some practical steps that you can really take to talk about this and implement this in a congregational setting. Before I share a couple slides, I just want to say that, resilience is really deeply bipartisan, because there are blue districts and there are red districts and there are purple districts, and they're all facing the impacts of climate change There are a number of places, people across the political spectrum are being flooded. Some of them disagree on why, some disagree on around climate change, and that's a place to do education and work with folks. But there's real fertile ground for collaboration and cooperation around resilience, which I think makes it a little bit distinct from some other areas. So I just want to present a few policy opportunities for climate resilience here. And first, we'll talk about at the federal level. So there are a few opportunities. The first is the Environmental Defense Fund is working on the Resilience Across America framework. And so what they did is they cataloged all of the bills that were introduced in Congress last session that had to do with resilience. And there were bills introduced by Republicans, bills introduced by Democrats, lots of bipartisan bills. And what they're doing is compiling these into a policy framework that we can pass this Congress in order to address some of the real challenges to resilience. And that includes coastal resilience, disaster relief from hurricanes, natural solutions to climate change along the coasts. And it's also a cross-agency approach. So, it goes from the Department of Commerce to the Centers for Disease Control. Resilience there is really important, as we know right now, to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, with flood mapping. So that's the first one to keep an eye out for. The second is ocean climate action. The ocean is the biggest carbon sink, and the ocean is warming faster than land is. And so as a policy area, our God's marine creation is extremely important. The third is a climate plan for public lands. Our public lands that are shared both at a federal level and at a state level hold immense power for both helping us adapt to and absorb the impacts of climate change, and also prevent climate change. Our biggest carbon sinks are in forests and in salt marshes. And God has provided these amazing tools for us to live in harmony with God's creation. And so we want to make sure that those are protected. And the final one is the Environmental Justice for All Act. And this is a bill that was introduced last session by Congressman McEachin and Congressman Grijalva. And what this gets at is exactly what we were talking about earlier. It's the intersection of race and climate change and other environmental justice issues. So those are four things that you can jot down and keep an eye out and talk to your members of Congress about. And then also, just like Jackie was saying, all politics are local. And that is especially true when it comes to climate change and climate resilience, because impacts are felt on a local level, and so much adaptation has to happen at a local level. So I'm offering two ways to get involved in local resilience work. The first is to just research and see if your state or if your city has a resilience officer or a resilience agency. More and more do. And if they don't, then that's something you can start advocating for. Because it's important to have people who are involved in state government who are focused on resilience. The second is state and city coastal resilience master plans. A number of coastal cities have developed these already, and it's really important, a really important practical step to advocate for so that we can ensure adaptation for all of our people. Now I'm going to shift real quick. I know I'm running out of time, from policy to practical congregational steps, and just offer this, which is, if you go to creationjustice.org/resilience, you'll see a number of resources that we've developed with Creation Justice Ministries, one of which is the Faithful Resilience Guide. This is a 6-part guide to building spiritual, physical, and social climate resilience in your faith community. And it includes 6 different themes around climate resilience that are theologically grounded, that are scripturally grounded, and that also include action items, which I know you all will love. So please take a look at this. It's perfect to be used as a study guide for a sermon series or for a small group, or if you're part of your community's green team or green ministry, this is perfect. So again, that's at creationjustice.org/resilience. And while you're there, there's a lot of really other good resources.
Thank you. And Keya, I'll let you say what you hope people will do for the next 6 to 10 months.
Very exciting to hear everyone's suggestions and would reiterate those. And just repeat what I was saying before about the need to reach out to our own communities and to try to bring people back into the fold. We know that there have been, like we've talked to our colleagues in Germany and South Africa about healing processes and bringing a community forward after great division. And one of the most important things is having those conversations. And we have a initiative called Arm in Arm, which is all about advancing local actions, but also all about empowering people to have those conversations locally. So I'll just put into the chat right now. There's a couple trainings coming up. There was actually one today, but there's a couple coming up on February 12th and 13th. And folks who sign up for the pledge will get notifications also when we have those specialized trainings on like on not just like, because it's easy to say everyone needs to go talk to their family members who have been Trump voters, but it's actually hard to do, and it's a skill set that needs to be developed in all of us. And so making sure that we're building that skill set and not just going and picking fights with people who we find triggering in our families, but actually learning how do we do that would be, to me, the biggest charge or suggestion or suggestion that I would have for the coming months.